Zombie Science, Part 8, which is actually Chapter 9. We've been going over the book by Jonathan Wells, Zombie Science, More Icons of Evolution, which is a sequel to another book in 2000, Icons of Evolution, Science or Myth, which documents that the icons don't die when they should, or they just keep traveling even though they're evidentially dead. There's the cover of the book. In the first chapter, we saw Who Let the Zombies Out, which had to do with introductory remarks, including about science, evolution, and how much you should trust scientists. The next chapter deals with the first two icons, which are the Tree of Life and homology. Actually, they're not the first two. They're just two of the more prominent ones. And then he deals with the other 8 that were in the first book, called Survival of the Fakest, the chapter is. And it discusses the Miller-Urey apparatus, Haeckel's embryos, Archaeopteryx, peppered moths, Darwin's finches, four-winged fruit flies, the horse series, which is now pretty much dead, and the chimp-human series. And then he discusses a new icon. It's not really a new icon in a sense, it's just not one that he included in his first book. And he points out that DNA, although it is necessary, is not enough to specify an organism alone, that you need other sources of information, so that mutating DNA is not going to be adequate for you to get a new organism. Then he talks about walking whales, which is what took the place of the horse series. And it has a couple of problems. It's missing the most important intermediates, and there's not enough time. And also, frankly, there's the molecular problem, which he doesn't address as much, but is there as well. And then there's the human appendix, another so-called junk DNA, which is a more interesting icon. He points out the arguments over vestigial organs and junk DNA fail both because they are not useless, which of course removes the theological sting, and because uselessness would not prove the point the arguers are trying to make. And then he discusses the human eye, and he notes that Darwinists ignore the obvious good design of the human eye and the difficulty in making an eye compared with the many times it arose according to the usual interpretation of the fossil record. And they even claim bad design, which is a little on the weird side if you think about it. Something that is as good as the eye is supposed to have been designed poorly. The proposed design, of course, does not behave nearly as well. At least theoretically it shouldn't. And then last week we talked about antibiotic resistance in cancer. And that chapter notes that contrary to Darwinists, antibiotic resistance is a good example of microevolution, which is mostly degenerative, but not macroevolution. And of course, cancer is not creative, and therefore if you hold that up as an example of evolution, you have just basically made the point that most evolution, if not all, is degenerative. But this week he tries to summarize what all this means, and he calls this chapter Zombie Apocalypse. He starts out, the icons of evolution are not textbook mistakes. They are used to promote a grand materialistic story even after scientists have shown that the icons misrepresent the evidence. They're tools of zombie science. When it comes to evolution, it seems establishment science is less interested in evidence and critical thinking than it is in promoting the doctrine that all life can be explained materialistically. Here is how Harvard geneticist and evolutionary biologist Richard Lewontin put it. And originally it said emphasis in the original, and neither in the book nor in the electronic version does it have the emphasis, which I found a little odd. I'm sure it was intended to be put back in. So I've restored it. When you see italics, those are actually not his italics. They're the original's italics as near as I can get to it. Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. Notice the opposition there. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite, those, by the way, are italicized in the original, somehow they didn't get back in when, this is the kind of thing you copy and you paste, and the italics can disappear if you're not careful, and apparently they did when he wrote the book, when Wells wrote his book. But in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just those stories. Notice that Lewontin is very critical of those kinds of things. But he says that doesn't ruin our theory, and the reason why is because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. And there's another place where the original doubled a commitment, and in the book it's left out. So I've kind of restored the quote a little bit. It is not that the methods and institutes of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. And that a priori is italicized as far as I can tell in the original. That's the way I remember it. I looked it up several places. Some places have it omitted or have it not italicized, but the most reliable ones do, in fact. And although I would have to say that's not really emphasis, I think that's just italicizing in a Latin phrase, which is fairly common. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Now, I'm going to complete the rest of the paragraph. This is where Wells stops, and because that's what he's interested in. But the rest of the paragraph says, the eminent Kant scholar Louis Beck used to say that anyone who could believe in God could believe in anything. To appeal to an omnipotent deity is to allow that at any moment the regularities of nature may be ruptured, that miracles may happen. So what Lewontin was really against was the idea of miracle, and at least part of the reason he was against it, I'm not sure it's all of the reason, but part of the reason is because science would be impossible. Because you never know whether your laboratory would come out one way or another. That might be an interesting topic for discussion afterwards. Getting back to Wells, he says Darwin's big idea is that unguided natural processes produce the first living cells, and that unguided natural processes transform those cells into the vast array of living things we now have. It's a big claim, and it's contrary to the evidence. Some of the big ideas constructs are patently absurd, and it relies heavily on unsubstantiated just-so stories. Yet materialism compels us to accept it. Zombie science rules, and its rule is corrupting our culture. In 2001, the American Public Broadcasting Service released an 8-hour-long series titled Evolution, which is still being shown to public school students. One of the most popular episodes, titled Why Sex, featured evolutionary psychologist Jeffrey Miller. According to the narrator, Miller believes the human brain, like the peacock's magnificent tail, is an extravagance that evolved, at least in part, to help us attract and mate, to pass on genes. Miller himself says that in the course of evolution, there was a sort of decision-making process that was selecting our brains. But it wasn't God, it was our ancestors. They were choosing their sexual partners for their brains, for their behavior during courtship. With the performance of Handel's Messiah in the background, why pick the Messiah instead of some secular? It's interesting. The narrator then says Miller is just getting started when he argues that the size of our brains can be attributed to our ancestors' sexual choices. He's also convinced that artistic expression, no matter how sublime, has its roots in our desire to impress the opposite sex. So Handel wrote his Messiah to get some sex. I think he was 90-something at the time and had a stroke. Evolutionary thinking is like reverse alchemy. It turns gold into lead. And this process is evident in religion, education, and science itself. Corrupting religion. American philosopher Daniel Dennett wrote in 1995 that Darwin's dangerous idea is like a universal acid. It eats through just about every traditional concept. Indeed, it cuts much deeper into the fabric of our most fundamental beliefs than many of its sophisticated apologists have yet admitted, even to themselves. Among our most fundamental beliefs, of course, is religion. Before Darwin, Christianity and science got along quite well, despite what many people think. Indeed, the founders of the most modern disciplines in biology and other scientific fields, such as chemistry and physics, were Christian. The false idea that religion and science have always been at war with each other was promoted by 2 books written in the late 19th century by followers of Darwin who were hostile to Christianity. In 1874, chemist John Draper published his History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, and in 1896, educator Andrew Dixon White published a History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. Modern scholars have repeatedly shown that their warfare metaphor profoundly misrepresents the true history of the relationship between Christianity and science. And in case you were interested, reference 5 happens to be a book co-edited by Ronald Numbers. There never was a war between religion and empirical science, but there is a war between religion and materialistic science, and the battleground is evolution. Polls show that religion in America is on the decline. In the past 2 decades, there's been a 3-fold increase in the number of people who say none when asked what their religion is. About half of those raised in a religion say that they left because they stopped believing, and many of these say they stopped believing because of science in general and evolution in particular. Most people learn about evolution outside the church, but over the past decade, believers in evolution have been increasingly successful in persuading clergy to bring evolution into their sanctuaries. Skipping a little bit, we can't read the whole thing, although it's really good read. I recommend that you read the original if you have the chance. This view that science and religion occupy completely separate realms was championed by Stephen Jay Gould, who called the realms non-overlapping magisteria. According to Gould, the net of science covers the empirical universe, what it is made of, fact, and why does it work this way, theory. The net of religion extends over questions of moral meaning and value. Some of you probably run into that. In other words, Gould argued that the world of objective reality belongs to science, which for him is materialistic, while religion is confined to the realm of subjective feelings and imagination. In effect, this is just a restatement of materialistic philosophy. It's a bully tactic to convince religious believers that they are not entitled to say anything about objective reality. Attempts to recruit Christian clergy to the cause of promoting evolution are motivated in part by the influence the clergy have over others. Eugenie Scott said in 2002, "I have found that the most effective allies for evolution are people of the faith community. One clergyman with a backward collar is worth 2 biologists at a school board meeting any day." The interesting thing is that Eugenie Scott is, as far as what she's professed, an evolutionist and an atheist. So basically she's coercing people who don't believe in her view of religion into helping her out. The next paragraph talks about Darwin Sunday, which was something that happened in 2007, I think. And in 2008, Zimmerman, who's the person behind Darwin Sunday, expanded Evolution Sunday to Evolution Weekend, thereby including Jewish congregations. I think he left Adventists behind, fortunately. In 2008, the United Methodist Church endorsed the Clergy Letter Project, and then it mentions the Evangelical Lutheran Church and the Presbyterian Church. So we're talking about major denominations that have endorsed the Clergy Letter Project. With so many clergy drinking Darwin's universal acid, it's no wonder that religion in America is declining. Corrupting education. In September 2014, psychology professor David Barash wrote in the New York Times that every year around this time with the college year starting, I give my students the talk. In the talk, Barash tells students that evolution is the underpinning of all biological science, and that Gould's magisteria are not nearly as non-overlapping as Gould claimed. Interesting comment. And you know what? I agree with him. Indeed, as evolutionary science has progressed, the available space for religious faith has narrowed. So materialistic science can invade the space Gould claimed was reserved for religion. Barash concluded that the more we know of evolution, the more unavoidable is the conclusion that living things, including human beings, are produced by a naturally, totally amoral process with no indication of a benevolent, controlling creator. So Barash begins his science course each year with a lecture bashing religion. Indoctrination into materialistic science begins well before college. In 2004, child psychologist Deborah Kellerman wrote that young children are intuitive theists who are disposed to view natural phenomena as resulting from non-human design. Shades of Romans 1:19, no? They wrote, there's more comment there, repeated spaced instruction on gradually scaled up versions of the logic of natural selection could ultimately place students in a better position to suppress competing intuitive theoretical explanations such that they could elaborate a richer, more abstract and broadly applicable knowledge of this process. Biologists have to constantly remind themselves that what they are seeing was not designed but evolved. Storybook interventions such as the ones reported here seem a promising start from which to promote scientific literacy in the longer term. See, what makes scientific literacy is you don't believe your eyes. Intervention usually refers to an effort to help someone overcome an abnormal addiction. For Kellerman and her colleagues, however, it means convincing children to overcome a normal intuition and adopt a counterintuitive belief that natural selection can produce the illusion of design. According to the authors, this belief constitutes scientific literacy. Indoctrination into zombie science continues into high school with help from the icons of evolution. Even so, political science professors Michael Berkman and Eric Plutzer lament the success of, quote, evolution deniers, end quote, and lay the blame largely at the feet of high school teachers whom they call enablers of doubt because of their own uncertainty about evolution. Maybe we should fire all of them except the evolution believers. Public school teachers who encourage students to think critically about the evidence for evolutionary theory may find themselves targeted by the National Center for Science Education, first mentioned in Chapter 3, which insists that any criticism of evolution is tantamount to religion. Jeannie Scott and her NCSE associate Glenn Branch also wrote in 2003 that teaching students there is a scientific controversy over evolution is equivalent to teaching that there is a legitimate historical controversy over whether the Holocaust happened. Argumentum ad Hitlerum. Corrupting science. Dennett's universal acid doesn't just eat through religion and education, it also eats through science, the very discipline on which it claims to depend. We've seen throughout this book how a belief in evolution leads to misrepresentations of the evidence. But belief in evolution corrupts science even more deeply than that. Chemist Linus Pauling, winner of 2 Nobel Prizes, wrote in 1958 that science is a search for truth. I think most of us could agree with that. At least it's supposed to be. In 2000, Bruce Alberts, then president of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, said, quoting Israeli statesman Shimon Peres, "Science and lies cannot coexist. You don't have a scientific lie, and you cannot lie scientifically. Science is basically the search for truth," saying basically the same thing. Thus, a system that does not permit the search for truth cannot be a scientific system. Period. In 2014, however, cognitive scientists Donald Hoffman and mathematician Chita Prakash argued that evolution produces perceptions that are not true. According to them, human perception evolved by natural selection, and evolutionary theory predicts that natural selection drives true perceptions to extinction when they compete with perceptions tuned to fitness. So according to Darwinian theory, human perceptions are more about survival than truth. They're not alone in making this argument, and I won't bore you with all the details, biologists Ajit Varkey and Danny Brower, but reality denial quickly extended, according to these people, to other aspects of reality and produced religion, which unfortunately leads many people to reject what Varkey and Brower regard as the ultimate reality of biological evolution by natural selection, which is now established as an incontrovertible fact. But if evolution maximizes fitness by eliminating true perceptions, how do Hoffman and Prakash know their perception of evolution is true? And if modern humans evolved to deny reality, how do Varkey and Brower know they're not denying reality when they claim evolution cannot be doubted? Oxford professor C.S. Lewis pointed out in 1947 that a theory which made it impossible to believe that our thinking was valid would be utterly out of court. The theory of evolution would itself have been reached by thinking, and if thinking is not valid, that theory would, of course, be itself demolished. It would have destroyed its own credentials. I think the snail eating its own tail, or the person sawing off the branch they're sitting on, comes to mind as other analogies. Lewis was a Christian, but New York professor Thomas Nagel is not. Nevertheless, Nagel made a similar argument in 2012. He pointed out that mind is a basic aspect of nature, but the materialistic doctrine of evolution denies the reality of mind, so it provides an account of our capacities that undermines their reliability, and in so doing, undermines itself. Nagel prefers not to believe in God, and he is not an advocate of intelligent design. Nevertheless, he says the materialist Darwinist, the neo-Darwinian conception of nature is almost certainly false. In fact, he says he is willing to bet that the present right-thinking consensus will come to seem laughable in a generation or two. For now, however, materialistic science rules. Valuing survival over truth is the practical end of this. For empirical science, the highest value is truthfulness, but for materialistic science, the highest value is survival of the fittest. Of course, there have been scientists in the past who put self-interest above the search for truth, and there are many scientists in the present who still consider truthfulness the highest value. But the pursuit of self-interest in the form of professional survival is on the rise. It has long been the case that many people in the academic world need to publish their thoughts or findings in order to keep their jobs and advance in their careers. The phrase publish or perish has been common for almost a century. And what is true for academics in general is even truer for scientists. Unfortunately, publish or perish in the scientific establishment has led to a growing tendency to sacrifice truth for professional survival. When published scientific articles are found to be untrue, they are sometimes retracted. The data on retractions can serve as a rough indicator of the growing problem. In 2011, Nature assistant editor Richard Van Noorden reported that in the past decade, the number of retraction notices has shot up tenfold, even as the literature has expanded by only 44%. Science journalist Paul Vussen wrote in 2015 that science today is riven with perverse incentives, most of them financial. Universities and financing agencies reward scientists based on their publication records, encouraging the submission of results that have not been carefully checked and often cannot be replicated afterwards. And in at least one case, were not replicated beforehand either, but they got one result they liked and they published it. In 2016, Paul Smaldino and Richard McElraith called the phenomenon the natural selection of bad science, noting that selection for high output leads to poorer methods and increasingly high false discovery rates. Some papers have to be retracted because of hasty or careless work, but a growing percentage of retracted papers results from deliberate fraud. In 2012, Fang, Casadeval, and Grant Steen reported that the percentage of scientific articles retracted because of fraud has increased about tenfold since 1975. So materialistic science in the practical sense, as well as the theoretical sense, is corrupting empirical science. But the effect of materialism on science is most obvious in the current controversy over intelligent design. Zombie science versus intelligent design. For most of the 20th century, opposition to evolution came mainly from a biblically inspired young earth creationism that rejected not only the claim that unguided evolution can produce all features of living things, but also the claim that the earth is billions of years old. And more importantly, life on earth is billions of years old. Even though establishment science lacked evidence for the first claim, it had enough evidence for the second to prevail over young earth creationism in most, though not all, academic and scientific institutions. Take note of that paragraph. It is the only paragraph where Wells says anything bad about young earth creationists. Even there, he doesn't go full bore. I think the reason is that Wells knows that a great deal of the people who are going to view his work positively are in fact young earth creationists, and that they can say pretty much amen to everything else he said. Yes?
Once you let God into the equation, your argument for a long time kind of falls apart.
Yes?
And so he needs to be careful there because he's opened the door to the possibility of recent creation.
I don't think he really minds that much. I think a lot of these people, if they could see their way to becoming young earth creationists, would be happy to do so. I think that it's rather that he thinks that the age question has probably been settled in terms of long age, and that that's not something he wants to take up. But I want you to notice that this is a long age person who is writing very carefully about young age creationists. None of the other things he said really have had any impact on young earth creationism. In the 1990s, however, a form of opposition to evolution with no position on the age of the Earth, notice it doesn't even say conceding the old age of the Earth, just with no position on the age of the Earth, rose to prominence in America: intelligent design. According to ID, it is possible to infer from evidence that some features of the natural world, including some features of living things, are better explained by an intelligent cause than by unguided natural processes. So, unlike young Earth creationism, ID is based strictly on scientific evidence rather than on a combination of scientific evidence and Bible-based arguments. Well, that'll be an interesting place to discuss eventually. The validity of ID's inference to design is controversial. What follows is not a defense of ID, but a brief account of the scientific establishment's reaction to it, a reaction that is quite revealing. In 1999, the Kansas State Board of Education voted to include microevolution but not macroevolution in its science teaching standards. Establishment science accused the board of eliminating evolution entirely and trying to sneak creationism into the curriculum. Although the new standards did not mention ID, the board was accused of promoting it. A month later, Kansas State University biologist Scott Todd wrote, "Even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such an hypothesis is excluded from science because it is not naturalistic." Shades of Richard Lewontin. The distinction between empirical science and materialistic science could not be more obvious. But ruling intelligent design out of court as unscientific is not enough for some evolutionists. In 2002, evolutionary biologist Massimo Pigliucci equated ID with creationism and wrote that creationism is more properly called evolution denial, a form of denial analogous to the denial of the Holocaust. Note again the argumentum ad Hitlerum. According to Pigliucci, in the case of creationism, the sinister characters are associated principally with the so-called intelligent design movement, which is bent on literally destroying science as we know it. Wow. In 2005, anthropologist Pat Shipman published an article entitled "Being Stalked by Intelligent Design," in which she wrote that I and my colleagues in science are being stalked with careful and deadly deliberation because the intelligent design movement is a deliberate campaign to undermine the teaching of science in America. Biologist and journal editor Gerald Weissman wrote that zealots of many stripes, including those of ID, are chipping away at evolutionary science. Weissman warned that our heritage of reason formed in the Enlightenment is becoming eclipsed by the Endarkenment, against which experimental science is our defense. In the same vein, physicist Marshall Berman wrote that ID poses a threat to all of science and perhaps to secular democracy itself. He predicted that if ID wasn't stopped, the curtain of Dark Ages too would begin to fall. Then in 2006, science journalist Robin Williams called ID a form of terrorism. Neil Shanks had some comments which we will skip over. They're similar to what you've heard before. In 2008, biologist and textbook writer Kenneth Miller, first mentioned in Chapter 2, some of you may recognize that name, claimed that to the ID movement, the rationalism of the Age of Enlightenment, which gave rise to science as we know it, is the true enemy. If ID prevails, he wrote, the modern age will be brought to an end. For Miller, what is at stake is nothing less than America's scientific soul, presumably the scientific soul of the world. Clearly, these writers confuse empirical and technological science on the one hand with zombie science on the other. Modern civilization depends on the first two, but it is threatened by the third. Pigliucci's science as we know it is zombie science. Shipman's teaching of science is indoctrination into zombie science. If Weissman really wants to use experimental science to fend off the Endarkenment, then he should direct his warnings at zombie science, not ID. It is zombie science rather than ID that abandons Schenk's reason rooted in evidence. And whatever Miller may think, zombie science is not America's scientific soul. Well, I guess it depends on which scientist you're talking to. Why this hysteria over ID? Because if the evidence shows that even one feature of living things, let's say the origin of life itself, is due to intelligent design instead of unguided natural processes, the whole evidence of zombie science comes crashing down. I have used the zombie metaphor throughout this book, but maybe the popular lore around battling vampires contains the best metaphor for fighting the dogmatic materialism masquerading as empirical science. One way to kill a vampire, according to popular lore, is to expose it to direct sunlight. And one thing ID proponents have is lots of light, in the form of a growing body of evidence against evolution and for intelligent design. Just reflecting on all of the evidence and how much new evidence in favor of ID has emerged in the past 20 years is enough to get me humming one of my favorite tunes. Here comes the sun. Little darling, I feel the ice is slowly melting. Little darling, it seems like years since it's been clear. Here comes the sun, here comes the sun, and I say it's all right. Unfortunately, it's not as musical as I wished, or I'd play that for you. Too optimistic? I don't think so. A growing number of biologists acknowledge that there are problems with modern evolutionary theory. In 1997, molecular biologist James Shapiro wrote that there are far more unresolved questions than answers about evolutionary processes, and he argued that what is needed is a third way between creationism and Darwinism to investigate possible intelligent cellular action in evolution. Shapiro was not advocating ID. Instead, he argued that all cells possess something akin to intelligence and a capacity for natural genetic engineering. Massimo Pigliucci, and in the Altenberg 16, there's a whole series of things that are related to this kind of thing. James Shapiro again, Shapiro along with Dennis Noble and Raju Bukadal, who created a website. In 2015, Nature published an exchange of views among scientists who believe that evolutionary theory needs rethinking and scientists who believe it is fine as it is. Those who believe the theory needs rethinking suggested that those defending it might be haunted by the specter of intelligent design, which is actually true, and thus want to show a united front to those hostile to science. Nevertheless, the former concluded that recent findings in several fields require a conceptual change in evolutionary biology. Yes, we need it against creationism, but it doesn't work. We need to try something else. Dennis Noble and several others, most notably Austrian biologist Gerd Müller, organized a public meeting to discuss an extended evolutionary synthesis at the Royal Society in London in November of 2016. Invited speakers included Noble, Shapiro, and Müller, among others. Müller opened the meeting by pointing out that current evolutionary theory fails to explain, among other things, the origin of new anatomical structures. Notice how much of this sounds like intelligent design complaints. That is macroevolution. Most of the other speakers agreed that the current theory is inadequate, though 2 speakers defended it. Although some proponents of intelligent design were in the audience, none of the speakers considered ID an option. One speaker even caricatured ID as God did it, and at one point, another participant blurted out, "Not God, we're excluding God." But they're stuck. Despite its failure to solve the problem of macroevolution, the meeting showed that current evolutionary theory is broken, and a growing number of scientists know it. When I was a boy growing up in northern New Jersey, a lake near our house would freeze hard in the winter, and I would skate on it with my friends. As the weather grew warmer in the early spring, the ice would become honeycombed with pockets of meltwater. Although the spring ice still looked thick and solid, my friends and I knew it was no longer strong enough to hold our weight, and we stopped skating on it. Today, evolutionary theory is like spring ice. It still covers the lake, and to many people it still looks solid, but it's honeycombed with meltwater. It can no longer carry the weight it once did. Summer is on the way. A scientific revolution? In 1962, historian of science Thomas Kuhn published his now famous work titled The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Forgot to italicize that, re-italicize that. You can see how Wells might have missed redoing that. Or what happens sometimes is you italicize it and you send it to the book, and then they send you back the prints and they aren't italicized. I say that having had that happen to me. And finally giving up and saying, okay, do it your way, because you can't get him to do it your way. According to Kuhn, most scientific work is normal science focused on solving problems within a paradigm. Kuhn's concept of paradigm has several meanings, including worldview and research program. It's a little slightly different, but a paradigm typically dominates funding, faculty appointments, and scientific journals, and its practitioners resist all attempts to place it with a new paradigm. They have mastered the old paradigm and devoted their careers to it. They have little incentive to help it crumble and strong incentives to keep it intact. So replacement doesn't happen easily. When replacement does occur, it is a scientific revolution. People involved in a scientific revolution often debate the very definition of science. Kuhn wrote, the reception of a new paradigm often necessitates a redefining of the corresponding science, the standard that distinguishes a real scientific solution from a mere metaphysical speculation. For example, Newton's theory of gravity was resisted. A lot of people don't know this, but it's true. It was resisted on the grounds that gravity, interpreted as an innate attraction between every pair of particles, no matter of matter, was an occult quantity, or occult quality. That is, the other rules of Newton were perfectly reasonable. You know, things bounce off each other, whatever. They all made sense. Gravity did not. Critics of Newtonianism claimed that it was not science, and its reliance on innate forces would return science to the Dark Ages. Whoa! And yet, obviously, it was the most successful theory until general relativity, which preserved most of its ideas. The current conflict between evolution and ID has the characteristics of a scientific revolution. Defenders of evolution control research funding, scientific journals, and faculty appointments. They resist all challenges to their paradigm, and they view even minor amendments, such as the extended evolutionary synthesis, with suspicion. Most fundamentally, defenders of evolution insist on retaining the materialistic definition of science that became dominant after Darwin. Kuhn wrote that at first a new paradigm may have few supporters, and on occasions the supporters' motives may be suspect. Nevertheless, if they are competent, they will improve it, explore its possibilities, and show what it would be like to belong to the community guided by it. This has been happening with ID. ID advocates have been improving and exploring their approach theoretically for several decades. In a 1998 book entitled The Design Inference, mathematician William Dembski developed the concept of specified complexity. Then later he wrote the book No Free Lunch, Why Specified Complexity Cannot Be Purchased Without Intelligence. Dembski and computer engineer Robert Marks started the Evolutionary Informatics Lab in Waco, Texas. In 2011, Dembski and Marks joined many other scientists at a conference at Cornell University, which incidentally was hosted by creationist John Sanford. And we discussed the book here. The book discussed new perspectives on biological information. A contract was signed with a major European scientific publisher for a volume containing the papers from the conference, but when defenders of evolution got word of it, they pressured the publisher to breach the contract. The volume was subsequently published in 2013 by a different scientific publisher. Clearly, there is a growing scientific community guided by intelligent design. According to Kuhn, an important issue in a scientific revolution is which paradigm should in the future guide research. A decision between alternative ways of practicing science is called for, and in the circumstances, the decision must be based less on past achievements than on future promise. In 2014, physicist David Snoke wrote, "Many have demanded that the intelligent design paradigm must come up with a successful, predictive, quantitative program for biology, but it seems that such a program already exists right under our noses." Systems biology, to be specific. Although most systems biologists believe in evolution, they cannot avoid using design language and design concepts in their research. And a straightforward look at the field indicates it is really a design approach. Scientists who explicitly accept intelligent design are also developing the new paradigm with empirical research. In 2005, molecular biologist Douglas Axe started the Biological Institute in Redmond, Washington, to support both theoretical and experimental work guided by the assumption that life appears to have been designed because it really was designed. In 2014, Axe and his colleagues Ann Gager and Mark-Claire Reeves published laboratory evidence that structural similarities among enzymes with distinct functions are better interpreted as supporting shared design principles than shared evolutionary histories. Also in 2014, a large conference was held in Brazil to discuss ID, organized by the Brazilian Society for Intelligent Design. I won't try the Portuguese. The conference attracted hundreds of people, including many interested scientists. According to one of the participants, the crowd represented a major change from previous years. In 1998, he said all the people in Brazil willing to be publicly identified as ID theorists would have fit into a VW van. So despite fierce opposition from establishment science, scientific interest in intelligent design is growing. In fact, its growth took an upward turn in 2016. Because evolutionists' defenders currently control public funding for science, which amounts to billions of dollars annually in the United States, ID must rely on private funding. In 2016, the Discovery Institute in Seattle received a grant to fund more than a dozen research projects directed by ID-friendly scientists at universities around the world. Here comes the sun, and the reign of zombie science is coming to an end. Now, my take on all this, I agree with Wells that Darwinian and neo-Darwinian evolution corrupts everything. Corrupts religion, but, from a quote, neutral position, one could argue that religion is false. It corrupts education, but one can argue that education needs to be changed. But when it starts corrupting science, it's cutting off the branch it's sitting on. It corrupts science theoretically. We evolved for reproduction and not truth, so why do we even trust our conclusion that we evolved for reproduction and not truth? And practically, if there is no God, everything is permitted, including scientific fraud. Lying for Darwin seems more intuitively attractive, frankly, than lying for Jesus. If people say that my theory values reproduction over truth, and I believe my theory, I think it is reasonable to believe them. I agree with Wells that the establishment has been unfairly hard on intelligent design. Look at the contrast with challenges to the theory of relativity or quantum mechanics. The people who defend relativity just kind of shrug their shoulders. Sure, go ahead. What's your theory say? What does it predict that relativity doesn't predict, or quantum mechanics doesn't predict? And let's test that. And it's especially exciting in quantum mechanics because quantum mechanics is going against the standard theory of materialism. And finally, I agree with Wells that the days of neo-Darwinism are probably numbered. Now, that does not mean that short-age creationism will take over as a majority position. Interestingly, this chapter contains the only criticism of short-age creationism in the entire book, and it is an oblique criticism. I think this is in spite of the fact that Wells, in other settings, has clearly stated that he is a long-age believer. I think that maybe we as short-age creationists can learn from this. One of the things that I've been a little bit discouraged about is people from creationism taking shots at intelligent design. But that's my opinion. Now it's your turn. Go ahead.
Get into the one of the basic issues here, which Lewontin raised, and which seems to have some validity, is the idea of the deus machina. Whenever you're in trouble, you just invoke God, and it works, because God can do anything. And this sounds like a good argument at first. But I would point out that Lewontin's exclusiveness to materialism is simply refuted by the concept that God created the laws of science that make science possible. The fact that science is easily testable in certain areas and produces results we like and so on is good. But this is no excuse for saying, well, don't invoke something that can work otherwise, even though it can work for a broader concept than some of us are comfortable with. The pioneers of modern science, Pascal, Galileo, Newton, Boyle, and they all invoked God and as the creator of the laws they were studying, and they established our modern science, the basic laws of our modern science. They showed how science and God can work very well together if God is the designer of science. And I think that door needs to be opened more often than it has been. That, no, sure, science works good, the laws are very fine. God created those laws.
Keep talking, it'll come up in just a minute.
It'll come up. Yeah, I'm nearest this second microphone, so I'll just leap at the opportunity to look at the overview. The thing that struck me with this chapter is that science is losing many, many arguments based purely on data.
Science being defined as zombie science or
yeah, the secular science.
Applied naturalism.
Yeah, naturalism. That's how I would define it, and that's how the Jonathan Wells has defined it.
Well, he's very careful to be clear about the distinction between experimental science and technological science.
Right.
And what he calls zombie science.
Yeah. So we're talking about naturalism. It's losing the argument when it comes to the actual data. One reason is the data is woefully incomplete, and it'll always be, because we're finite individuals and we're not gods, so we can't collect all the data and then make our pronouncement. The second reason, data often has conflicting data that seems to point in two or more directions. That's very true, and that's why science often says, well, we have to operate with multiple hypotheses because there are different ways of looking at it. So now, with religion, you might say that science cannot fault religion then if religion sticks with data, because they're losing the argument with data. If I'm correct in my analysis, at least partly losing it. And so what this chapter points out to me is you can go to a higher level, jump above the ground, go to, you might say, metaphysics rather than physics, or meta-science rather than science itself, and jump into the realm of philosophy. And materialism is a philosophy. If you boil it down, I don't think it's purely a science. It can be, but materialism, when you really analyze it, it's a world view.
Well, it's a view that says that only certain kinds of answers are true.
Exactly.
And it depends on who you're listening to. Some people will say because every time we keep going after it, we keep finding that materialistic answers are better.
Yeah.
Another argument would be, no, they're ruled out of court to begin with. Lewontin, of course, would be in the second camp.
Exactly.
But the first camp is, at least theoretically, and I think I would argue practically, vulnerable to scientific arguments for intelligent design.
Mm-hmm.
Because, and I would actually say that from my point of view, your analysis is incomplete in an important way. The truth of the matter is that science being incomplete simply allows multiple hypotheses.
Exactly.
Science not having conflicting data allows for multiple hypotheses.
Precisely.
The problem that science really runs into, and it's most acute at the origin of life, is that sometimes the evidence is overwhelmingly against a materialistic explanation.
Mm-hmm.
To start with a material explanation for life on Earth, and to finish with an explanation for life in the universe. Because, you know, if you say, well, aliens sent little bits of matter off to the Earth and it hit and started to grow at the, let's say at the, Precambrian level, and then evolved from there. Now you have to explain the aliens. And if intelligent life required a long period of evolution to get where we are, then the aliens must have had a long period. Mm-hmm. And how did they get started? And it's the interesting thing, people who say, well, who created God? Well, that's actually kind of theologically ignorant. Because one of the things that has always been said of God is that God wasn't created, he was there originally. But you can't do that with life in the universe.
Mm-hmm.
You can only go about 13.7 plus or minus whatever billion years, and you hit a hard wall. And when you hit that hard wall, the intelligence that created that first intelligence, and maybe you created our intelligence too, once you've got that intelligence, why limit him? Mm-hmm. That intelligence has to have the basis for its intelligence, not the organization of matter. Because at the beginning there was no matter. Or there was one thing of matter that had no organization of that kind.
It used to be matter was considered to be eternal. It would just change its shape, or it would move from one place to another, but there was always matter because it's eternal.
And we know that matter is now equivalent to energy, can be converted into energy, can be converted 100% into energy if you happen to have antimatter with it.
True.
And so there is no requirement that matter is eternal.
Right.
And everybody knows that. And that's a huge problem if you're trying to be a materialist.
Yeah.
And so the actually matter, materialism is under extreme stress in that area. It's as close to a disproof as you can get in science. Mm-hmm. And in that case, you're kind of, it's not just a matter of you can believe either way. It's a matter of the evidence is against where these people want to take us.
So what you're saying is one of the weakest points of materialism is when it comes to origin of the universe and origin of life on our planet.
The origin of life is way worse than the origin of the universe.
I would think so.
You can do a deist thing and have maybe some god of some kind create the universe, but just then let it run.
Yeah.
But in the origin of life, you have to get inside that universe and start monkeying with stuff.
And you're dealing with known laws, and you're dealing with a lot of parameters that
Right.
are finite and that limit what can be done.
Yeah.
Just one more comment, and I'd like to hear some other comments. We
Look
often
at you.
have the expression science and technology because science loves to be associated with technology because that's the practical day-to-day application of science. And we speak of the scientific revolution, and right alongside it is the technological revolution, as if they're twins, you know.
You think about this, 100 years ago, you and I would both be using our speaking voice in order to make this work.
Yeah. But if science migrates to a higher level, namely materialism, in order to survive, you'd have a hard time saying materialism and technology. It doesn't make sense. It's the same way if you said religion and technology. I mean, technology basically is neutral when it comes to religious questions. Now, that could probably be argued, but so when you bring in technology as a twin of science, it doesn't really help anything. Those are my thoughts for the day.
Go ahead.
So speaking of technology, as science has progressed, our ability to observe things has gotten better and better, and we're able to look deeper and deeper. And I think at the earlier aspect of that, we were able to have what Gould says are two realms that are distinct and separated from each other. You know, notwithstanding what Barash said, where science is invading religion space, I can see where religion is invading sciences, the zombie science, in terms of what you brought up at the end in quantum mechanics. I mean, our ability to detect photons and subatomic particles has led to the conclusion, if you look strictly at the observation, using materialism, that particles know when you're looking at them, and they know before you look at them that you're going to look at them. And who could think of such a insane conclusion?
And yet, the particles have no brains and no eyes
Correct.
to figure this out.
Yeah. And yet that's the conclusion that you have to come to. And I think it's ironic that it comes specifically at the observing aspect of it that does this, which is where the rubber meets the road with materialism, is observation. And it's this assumption, the whole science is founded on this assumption that observation doesn't affect the thing that you're observing. And quantum mechanics tells us the opposite.
Yeah.
I find it quite interesting. Let me speculate a little bit, as there's some very, very good science in big science going on. And as it's done, they understand the logic of living systems better and better. This growing understanding could, and I'm imagining at some future time, probably a big group of scientists, starting with the basic raw materials of basic chemicals, and using what they've learned, develop a system, put it together, and it has the characteristics of being living. So this brings up and in the process, they change features of what living is. Now, I'm not a good enough prophet to say this will happen, but I think I can say with confidence, if it did happen, the creators would get a Nobel Prize rather than being tossed out because they used intelligent design. In other words, to me, the whole issue is design that shapes things, that's outside of the human realm of possibility. And if you can bring it within, I'm sure we would celebrate it rather than say, nah, it couldn't be.
Well, I will say this, though. If these people were to say, and we're following the Creator's thoughts after him, they very well might not get a Nobel Prize. There's actually precedent for that. The person who is probably the key person for figuring out how to use magnetic resonance to create imaging was excluded from the Nobel Prize. And the reason why is because he was a creationist and they knew it and they didn't want to give comfort to creationists.
Well, I think you're precisely making the point I wanted to make. If at the same time this group claimed that the intelligent design they used evolved, they'd be golden.
Yes, that I would agree with.
So the problem is we don't, materialistic science will not look outside of itself.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm thinking about the dangerous effect of this evolutionary thinking. So the idea is we evolved from these ape-like ancestors that are very unintelligent, can't do very many things, struggle to create a wheel, stuff like that. And now we're this evolved, very intelligent being that is so much better than what we've evolved from. But I think there's a grave danger to this egocentric kind of thinking with this evolutionary theory, where look what we're doing to our world. We're destroying the planet. We're making it uninhabitable for so many species. And then we use this intelligence as justification for abusing all the other creatures that live on this earth. You know, it's all for us because we're more important. We can destroy the planet, we can pollute it, we can do all kinds of things. And when we contrast this with the biblical-based creation view, where we were created perfect in a perfect world, and we fell from that when we disobeyed God and tried to do things our own way, we kind of have this reverse idea. And so if we instead adopt this view that we were created as this perfectly intelligent being, and that the things we're doing are actually in contrast to that wisdom that God created us with, then I think that would instill a sort of humility that would counteract this egocentric negative effect of destroying our planet, where it's like God created us to be stewards and caretakers of this planet, and that's the kind of thing we need to return to, not this building technologies to create these weapons of mass destruction to use on our neighbors and on all the other species of the planet. So I think that the effect of coming back to a creationist kind of account to kind of take back science might also have the effect of taking back the technologies that are created with these sciences, to where instead of creating weapons and things like that and ways of destroying the planet more efficiently, maybe we can sort of take back the planet and make it more inhabitable and loving our neighbor and taking care of the other species, if we go back to that kind of thinking.
I think there is some truth to that, a great deal of truth to that. But I think also that vision can be enlarged even slightly. People always think of the damaging things we do as such things as atomic bombs, maybe AK-47s, that kind of stuff. But there are some other things that are turning out to be equally, maybe even more destructive, because they tend to be used with less compunction. And that's things like surveillance. You know, the fact of the matter is that everyone right now who's carrying a cell phone, your location is known to the phone company, and with a little work, and depending on whether it's been done yet or not, maybe even right now, it's known to the federal government. Yeah, you turn off your locator, but nobody does that.
I do.
Very few people do. Think about that. What that means is that people can know, where you are. If the government keeps track of email, they can know exactly what you're thinking. Beyond that, if Google wants, they can slant their display of search engine results for or against particular opinions. And it is, a matter of time before somebody gets hold of that. As I understand it, it's already happened in terms of politics, but it's a matter of time before that kind of thing could be used in terms of religion, in terms of science, in terms of the religion-science interface. And all of a sudden you won't be able to find out what you really should be able to, and perhaps even need to. Filters are built in all over. The idea that this is all just open is actually a myth. And the book noted the problem with fraud. People have no idea how much the problem of fraud is there. In my own profession, medicine, Amgen decided they wanted to know how many cancer studies were based on, these are, seminal cancer studies, original kind of, set the field, new concept kind of things, are really reliable because they're getting ready to pour billions of dollars into it. They have that kind of money, and they want to know, are we secure in funding this research or that research, or should we just not do one of them? And so they went and picked out 53 studies. 47 of them were not reproducible. That's horrible. Now, maybe some of them weren't reproducible because when they tried, they didn't get it exactly right. You could perhaps explain 2 or 3 of them that way, but 47? They talked to somebody who had produced one of those studies, and they said, well, actually, we tried it 5 times. Or they tried it 13 times and not been able to reproduce it. Said, we tried it 5 times, and the 5th time we got results, and so we published. You think about what that means. When he says that science has turned into a survival of the fittest and the truth doesn't really matter, turns out he wasn't kidding. That's scary to think about.
Following the evolutionary paradigm.
Yeah?
Right over there.
We got a mic for you right there. Go ahead, Wes.
I think it's very interesting that to hear scientists debate among themselves, which is basically what you've been presenting. The scientists who have presented and come up with such terms as zombie science, and those who like the term Darwinian science, are basically all very scientific sorts. Broadly defined. They're for academics, and some write extremely well, better than actually one can be accepted. I think the author of this book, as of several of the others that you've quoted,
are, if nothing else, extremely effective writers. But meanwhile, observation tells me, my observation of such media as, say, the Drudge Report, that all of this is being leapfrogged. While the scientists are debating between themselves on a very high level, the Me Too movement is happening. And as to science versus technology, the head of Apple is a gay. And he is very much, at least as much interested in promoting social issues, social justice, as in his technology. Now, Facebook and Amazon are technically technologies, but they are more and more being considered social issues and philosophical issues. Certainly the CEOs of these organizations get called into science and Congress and raked over the coals about why they're being so promiscuous with privacy, why they're allowing to have conservative or rather liberal views show up first in the Amazon search. All of these things are really taking precedence over what I've been listening to this morning, as impressive as that is. It seems like these scientists are kind of receding into their own little closet and arguing among themselves, while what's happening in the real world is really quite different. It's very social. They even haul morals into this when an Al Gore can be heard and talk about morals and what's right for the planet with more authority than your really very well written scientists. It's changing, and that's changing fast.
Well, one of the things that's happening is that while there is still a sizable portion of the American population that is Christian, and that because of the kind of Christianity tends to lean towards a more fundamentalist view of things, America is close to unique in that particular aspect. The people that I think the phrase that's used most commonly is the elites are pretty much solidly in favor of, if not Darwinian theory, at least evolutionary theory. And therefore there's a big disconnect in the United States between the average people, a good share of which are in what's derisively called sometimes flyover country, and the people who consider themselves their betters, and in fact most of whom that ethos actually rules the way the media, the way Hollywood, the way all of the so-called cultural leaders are. It's difficult to see how that circle is going to be squared, and I have a feeling that that there is a great deal of there's a great deal of cognitive dissonance that's not likely to be resolved anytime soon, where the majority, it's still probably the majority, or it's a substantial minority at least. I think it's 44 plus 36% of people believe that there's a God that can intervene. that did intervene in history, in fact. And then I would imagine that probably a good close to 90% of the people who, let's say, run news departments, and certainly 95% of evolutionary biologists, and probably more than that. I mean, a substantial portion of scientists in general are in fact believers that there is no God that could intervene.
And that's the point I wanted to make. All the folk, the scientist name that you had today, who sounded more Indian, would all fall into the ID side. He's a top scientist. So perhaps there's going to be folk from the hidden lands who are going to be with us in paradise.
Well, this is one of the things that I think that the elites who are really paying attention realize, and they're terrified by it, is that if intelligent design and short-age creationism unite forces, they're enough to completely turn over the society that they're in. Most of the time they just don't. And one of the things that I would argue is we'd be very, very careful about shooting at, you saw one little tiny blip of a shot on a guy who believes that we're just plain wrong on the age of the earth, but who doesn't want to say that out loud any more than he absolutely has to. And I think that in general, we need to get used to the idea that Jesus said that not only he who is not for us is against us, but he also said he who is not against us is for us. And that when people don't want to shoot at me, I have no business shooting at them. In fact, I would go further to say if people are shooting at me, if you love your enemies, the best that you can do is put up a shield against it. Anyway, next week we will be discussing 180 million year old tissue that's still around. Yeah, it's gone up from the 75, 80 million years in the dinosaurs. We now have an ichthyosaur that's been studied. Relatively hot off the press.